Hello, I hope you're doing well. I wanted to do a quick video for you to. I know you're probably sick of seeing my face with all these long presentations I'm giving you, but I hope you're finding them at least kind of decent. Um, this first assignment I want to give you is going to be, well, I call this Giants of Psychology. And I'll just read this. So development psychology is a discipline with deep roots in the history of psychological thought. In this assignment, I'm asking you to explore the works of one of the great giants of psychology listed below, with a focus on how their teaching can be applied in really meaningful ways in our current, in our modern era in 2022. And so I'll come back to this in a second. These are all the people. You're not limited to this list. If there's a specific individual or school of psychology you want to focus on, you can email me and I'll probably approve it. What I want you to do with this assignment is focus on this idea of like, who is this intellectual? Why should we care? I like asking like the why should we care? I know it's a kind of weird question, but I like asking that a lot on assignments. Is like, well, make the argument, right? Like, tell me who the person is, make the argument for the relevance. I say there, yeah, make an argument to me or to the audience and the reader that this individual's work still has value in our modern times for modern students. Number two, or maybe that it doesn't, right? Maybe you argue against it, although I don't know how that would, for that list. Maybe you could argue that like some of the ideas may need to be updated if you're talking about some of those people specifically. But I don't know, they're giants of psychology for a reason. It's like their work is speaks pretty strongly for itself. Number two, okay, so first of all, basically I got rambly there. Basically, number one is just like, who is the intellectual that you picked? Why are they relevant or interesting, right? Especially like in relation to our modern era. What's the key theoretical contribution that you think, in your opinion, sort of, what's the key contribution that that person made? You can kind of see when we go up that like I have a person's name and I have like kind of their big idea underneath, and that's at least designed to give you a starting point. You've heard of some of these people before. What does the number three, what does that contribution that you said before, their big contribution, have to teach us about human psychology, especially in our modern time? And how can you use that teaching to add value to your own life? So I have that separated into those different questions like that. But I do understand that like there's obviously not overlap, but connection between two and three. Three is kind of an extension of two. If you want to write this in a different way, you don't have to necessarily structure it as four responses. And on that point, let me just say this. You have three different ways you can do this. Okay, and I'll say this first, just so people, maybe you're nervous because you saw like the video and audio options first. And if you're not comfortable with that, there's definitely, I'm okay with people doing a more traditional written essay and to just treat it like kind of an academic paper. I put that I'd like to, I don't know, I put I twice, but I'd like to encourage people to do either audio or video because it's kind of fun to mark those. I don't know, it's kind of cool to get to see it too. And like, just, I've always enjoyed doing that with students, but if people would prefer to write, that's completely fine with me too, because I like reading people's writing too. So if you do write it, I'm gonna say 6 pages minimum, 8 maximum, double spaced, APA. That's basically it. And then if you wanted to do like something kind of creative and make like a video, and you could either do like a slideshow in PowerPoint and then record into it, or you could just do like a straight video talking to your phone, do like almost a reaction, answering the questions to the phone, or you could make like a podcast kind of thing. I'm pretty open. And if you're interested in that and not sure how to do it tech wise and want to chat, like I'm open to that too. Okay, so I went over the questions. Now the people that you could do it, and it's like, I'll try not to do a massive rant on all these people, but like Viktor Frankl, one of the most important psychologists of all time, right? Created logotherapy. He was in Auschwitz in the concentration camp, and after he got out, he wrote this book, The Man's Search for Meaning, where he presents he talks about his time in the camp and also presents this theory that he comes up with on logotherapy, what logotherapy is and how core meaning is to surviving. Freud and psychoanalysts, right? Like basically the beginning of psychology. His daughter, Anna Freud, and her work on psychoanalysis and also the ego, right? She has a hugely significant book called Ego Psychology. She wrote a lot about like defense mechanisms and was a huge defender of her dad's work. Carl Jung and analytical psychology, like Carl Jung may be the most interesting psychologist. Carl Rogers, like definitely the psychologist that influenced kind of modern counseling the most in his humanistic psychology. Piaget, another maybe the, I'm just gonna sound like I'm hyping up all these people, but I am calling this the giants of psychology. Piaget is like probably the most underhyped psychologist that exists. He's definitely the most significant in the terms of developmental psychology. William James, you could argue, is like kind of the American father of psychology. He is a few years before Freud, but he's a little bit more philosophical, and he's coming with this idea of functionalism, which if you're not aware of would be an interesting one for you to dig into. Erickson, you've heard of before, but if you're to take one of the ones that I kind of think you'd have heard of, I want you to kind of maybe take a deep dive into them and look at like Erickson's pretty interesting. I know that you've probably heard about his like psychosocial model, but like if you pick Erickson, you might want to look into some of his other ideas. You might want to look into Erich Fromm, right? Another really interesting guy that was trained in Freud school, and he had an interesting path because I don't know if saying that he sold out Freud is too strong, but kind of there's this like weird, because politics was like an influence at the time, as it always is, right? And there's this place called the Frankfurt School where Fromm kind of was a main person in trying to kind of combine this Marxist socialist kind of way of looking at things with like a psychodynamic view of like the unconscious. And maybe I'll stop at that, but that Frankfurt School, not my cup of tea. B.F. Skinner, American behavioralism. So like B.F. Skinner, another like super fascinating guy. Sabrina Spellrein, she's fascinating. If you saw the movie A Dangerous Method, that's about the relationship with Freud and Jung, which almost I would love to almost like, I don't know how I would do it, but watch it with the class. But Sabrina Spellrein, she's so interesting and I love including her on this because sometimes the students that pick her are often like quite surprised because they've often not heard of her. She's a kind of interesting person to place historically. She doesn't have a ton of writing, although she did some really interesting writing on psychoanalysis. What's in some ways most noteworthy about her is who she was, the social circle she was in, right? Like she was really close with both Freud and Jung, maybe the two most famous psychologists ever. They were in a bit of a triangle, and it was like an intellectual attraction. It wasn't just that it wasn't like they found, well, they did find her beautiful, but it wasn't that. It was that like, well, let me give you an example. She once impressed Freud so much with an idea at a party. Like this is Freud. She impressed him so much with her idea that if there's a life instinct, there must also be a death instinct, right? If there's a libido, life instinct, there must also be what later Freud goes and writes a paper called Thanos, right? That they're Thanos, not Thanos like the Avenger, but right. So it's like, what's my point? My point is that if we're saying all these other people were giants, and in their writings, both Freud and Jung speak of her as absolutely their equal. And I think that's like an interesting point. She's an interesting person to look into. Watson, the guy that did the little Albert experiments, right? The person that coined the term behavioralism, famously made the comment of like, I can make any kid anything, basically. I forget the exact quote, but something like, I can make any kid like a plumber or a doctor or a soldier. I just need to create the right like learning environment. Bandura, you've learned about Bandura, but if you're doing Bandura, I'd like you to look into this idea of reciprocal determinism. Alfred Adler in individual psychology. Individual psychology is the most weirdly named because you would assume that that's really about like personal autonomy and freedom kind of, and that kind of individual. And it's actually like almost the opposite. Adler's an interesting guy and a complicated guy, and they, like, people sometimes say no one's had more stuff and ideas stole from them in psychology than Adler. Adler was the second of the Viennese or the Viennese, coming from Vienna. I forget how you pronounce that, but basically there's like the school of psychoanalysis from Vienna, right? So Freud's the first, then Adler, then Jung, and then Frankel. Right, so like Austria and Vienna like really was a hotbed of psychology, just as Britain. I mean, not, yeah, because it's kind of like Britain a little bit, Russia a little bit, Vienna a lot, the States a lot. Ken Wilbur, one of the more recent ones on this list, integral theory. Sorry, the reason I know of like the pace of this video is really slowed down at first. I'm like just trying to quickly give you an overview. Now I'm just like into ramble mode, but I'm trying to just say a few words on each of these people so that hopefully one of them sparks your interest. Melanie Klein, really interesting. Object relation theory, like huge relevance for understanding social dynamics, right? How we relate to objects in our environment. Melanie Klein, fascinating psychoanalyst. Ayn Rand, Ayn Rand is a giant amongst giants. She's not even technically a psychologist, but the reason I have her on this is like and she's not even someone that wrote a ton of theory, although she did definitely write books that were more straight up philosophy or whatever. But her books, Atlas Shrugged and Fountainhead, are so psychologically deep that I think she demands to be on this list. And she basically presented ideas around objectivism and functionalism. Maslow, his whole idea around self-actualization, you're probably really familiar with Maslow, but he's still absolutely a giant of psychology. Same with Pavlov. Karen Hornet, you might have heard of her. She's like probably one of the most articulate critics of Freud, even though she was a student of Freud in a way. And so I find her very interesting, and I really respect her because she was probably the best at like disagreeing with Freud, but still respecting him as a person. Because this is the thing that happened, right? It's like there was like a lot of people like starting to break away from Freud, like maybe Hornet, but again, I was saying she did it in a pretty cool way, like maybe Adler, or even Jung at the time when Jung started to split. But Freud also had like and that's just his inner circle, right? There's lots of people outside of his inner circle that had issues with Freud, but Freud also had like a pretty intense team of defenders, led quite heavily by a guy named Otto Rank, who would be interesting for you to look up sometime and just Google, like OTTO, and then the last name Rank, like RANK. Okay, where am I? A couple more. Vygotsky, he's a zonist proximal development guy, but if you like look more into him, you probably, if you've heard of him, it's in that ZPD, the zone of proximal development, that people learn better when they're in learning fostering environments, basically just that the learning situation matters. Virginia Satir really kind of started this whole idea of family psychology, and just excellent therapist. Philip Zimbardo is the guy, he wrote the Lucifer Effect, but he's also the prison experiment guy. Stanley Milgram is the obedience guy, or the shock guy. So those two are just on the list because those are the two of the most kind of epic social psychology experiments. Martin Sliegman, the founder of positive psychology, which is something that you'd maybe be interested in looking into. And then two kind of interesting last ones, Fritz Perls and Gestalt therapy. If you've never heard of that, that might be an interesting one for you to do. And then Albert Ellis, who is a weird guy in some ways. And if you watch some like YouTube videos of him, you'll kind of get the vibe of why I say is like, he's just kind of, he's just an interesting character. But Albert Ellis is absolutely on the list. And he created this thing called rational emotive behavioral therapy. All right, everyone. I'm not sure how long this has been because I don't have a timer on this, but like, basically you'll see here, something back to the questions. Who is the intellectual? Why should we care? What are their key theoretical contributions? What do those contributions have to teach us about psychology, especially in our modern times? And then how can you use that to add value to modern life? Again, I'm sorry, I'm kind of yawning, but it's like, well, it's like after 12 here, and I'm an old guy. All right. Hope you're enjoying the course decently. This is the first assignment, and next time you see me, I'll be talking about infancy. All right. Cheers. And thanks for being a great class. Hope you have a good week and you're doing all right. Cheers.